Another bit of colorful excitement has been in my home for a couple of months, and that has been the banner project. There are more than 100 banners, more than 100 beautiful historical banners that were created by my dear friend Nancy Morrow. And my wife Jinna has been renovating those banners this year with her team. And Jinna and our friend Joan Hughes made the 5x7 banner that hangs over the stairway to the upper lobby. And I watched that come into being. Jinna pieced it together, Joan quilted it, and Jinna applied the glitz and the sparkly things. Take a look, and I'm very proud of it, and I've seen it on my dining room table and on the living room floor and hanging up on the wall, and now it's here. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm not a visual artist, but I'm smart enough to live with somebody who is. It's a lot of fun. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I get to talk about Handel. Many of you may have been here last night when I was talking about Bach. And I love to talk about these two gentlemen back to back because they are so exceedingly different in their personalities, their lives, their career paths, and their music. They are very, very different. I find it an amazing turn of events that in the history of Western music, the composer who created the most beloved choral music in the English language was actually a German whose real passion and fame in his lifetime was as a composer of Italian opera. Handel wrote more than 40 operas, and he also created some of the most delightful and engaging keyboard and orchestral music of the Baroque period, and he was a renowned virtuoso on the organ. But until the fairly recent upsurge in interest in his operas over the past, say, 20, 25 years, Handel was largely remembered for one particular musical form, the oratorio, which is something he only resorted to later in his life and only when Italian opera fell out of favor. Oratorio, by definition, is a large-scale musical work for orchestra and voices. It typically is based on a narrative, on a religious theme, or a biblical story. It is typically these days performed, I say these days, performed without the use of costume, scenery, or dramatic action. Well-known examples of oratorio are Handel's Messiah, Bach's Christmas oratorio, which is 6 cantatas telling the Christmas story, or Haydn's Creation, which tells the biblical story of the creation of the earth in 7 days. Alexander's Feast, by this definition, is not, strictly speaking, an oratorio because it is not based on a sacred text or biblical story. Nonetheless, the secular works that Handel created side by side with his sacred oratorios are all included under the general heading oratorio because they contain all the building blocks, orchestra, voices, some kind of narrative story, whether or not it's actually biblical. So we use the term oratorio loosely, more as a style of, more as a description of who's performing it rather than what the storyline is. But before I tell you the story of today's oratorio, let me tell you Handel's own story, which is very fascinating, I think. Georg Friedrich Händel, I almost said his English name, Georg Friedrich Händel, was born on February 23rd, 1685, about 4 weeks before Johann Sebastian Bach, and about 100 miles away. Their lives could not have been more dissimilar. They never met. And yet they existed in two parallel universes within the world of Baroque music. Handel was the son of a prominent physician at the court of the Duke of Saxony. Handel's father hoped that his son would have a career in law, but he did allow his son to study music with the great organist Friedrich Zachau, a composer who was familiar with the then modern Italian style. And apparently Zachau gave the boy a good foundation in composition and music theory and instruction in organ, harpsichord, and violin. Right away, I won't be referring to Bach all the time, but right away we see the difference. Bach came from a family who was on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. Bach did not have a lot of money. Bach was orphaned at an early age and forced to make his own way in life and he was largely self-taught. Handel had the benefit of an upper-class upbringing and excellent training, as I said, in music theory, organ, harpsichord, and violin as a boy. By the age of 13, he was already composing cantatas for performances at church. There's no indication that Bach wrote any music at all before he was 17 or 18. At 17, Handel was appointed organist at the cathedral in Halle. In 1703, at the age of 18, he moved to Hamburg, where he was a violinist in the orchestra of the Hamburg Opera. Within a year, when he was about 19, Handel had become a conductor at the opera, and he led productions from the harpsichord, and he became increasingly influential in the artistic direction of the company. Handel was a big man, and he was big in every way, including his personality. Geniuses can be a real pain in the posterior, and I can imagine that Handel was no exception to that. And so it's no surprise to me that after composing his first 4 operas when he was 20 and having them premiered at Hamburg, he left the opera in 1706 when it became apparent that they had no interest in giving him any more power than he already had. And he was passed over for the job of music director. So, but this fabulous career in Hamburg in the opera was typical of his entire career. He created a big musical sensation wherever he went. And he also had an amazing ability to do what we today would call schmoozing or networking, to make influential social connections. He was always moving up. Bach was always moving forward. Bach was always trying to survive. Bach was always trying to deal with his employment situations. Handel was always trying to work up to place himself on a higher and higher position as a freelance musician, which Bach never was. The great 18th century journalist Charles Burney wrote, Handel's general look was somewhat heavy and sour, but when he did smile, it was like the sun bursting out of a black cloud. There was a sudden flash of intelligence, wit, and good humor beaming in his countenance, which I never saw in any other. Friends and eyewitnesses, including the great Charles Burney, describe Handel as a polished and impeccably mannered gentleman who spoke 4 languages fluently, Italian, French, English, and his native German, although the first 3 he spoke with a decidedly heavy German accent. He was completely at ease with people of all socioeconomic classes. And he had an amazing ability, as I said, to network and connect and find possibilities for moving forward. And here is a very good example of how Handel managed his career. While he was in Hamburg, he's now about 20, he's in Hamburg and he makes the acquaintance of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And the Duke suggested a visit to Italy. And so he leaves the opera, as I said, he resigns from his position at the opera and he heads south to Italy for 4 formative years. He's in his early 20s. His 4 years in Italy from 1707 to 1711 had a very profound influence on his music. He absorbed all the latest trends and styles that were then in Italy. And Italy was, at that point, the musical capital of Europe. And Handel threw himself into the whirlwind musical and cultural life there. He quickly built a reputation in Italy as an organist and harpsichordist, both for his technical virtuosity and for his amazing improvisational abilities. It's important to remember that the great organists of this time were able to improvise on the organ much the way a jazz musician would riff on a tune today. If I said to a great jazz pianist, improvise on Hoagy Carmichael's Stardust for 5 minutes, and the jazz piano would start by playing the tune and then start to improvise and start to create variations and modulate and simply improvise on that tune. This was a very great art among these great musicians in these days. They all could do it. Scarlatti, Vivaldi, Bach, Handel. They actually had competitions between each other. Handel is said to have beaten Domenico Scarlatti in an impromptu improvisation contest in Rome. So this was a very important part of the organist's skill, and Handel actually would sometimes entertain later on in his life, during his oratorio performances in London, he would entertain the audience at intermission by improvising to called out tunes. During what we would call the intermission, he was entertaining from the organ. While he was in Italy, he wrote lots and lots of vocal music, including operas, sacred works, cantatas, and more importantly, he became familiar with the Italian oratorio. Now, Italian oratorio had become a sort of replacement for opera, especially in Rome, where opera performances were periodically banned by the Pope. So the oratorio was presented to the public as a sacred drama with recognizable characters, a dramatic storyline, and in fact, the Italian oratorios in Italy at this time, in the early 1700s, were usually fully staged with scenery, costumes, and acting. There was often no chorus, but there were lots and lots of ensemble numbers that the soloists sang together. During his time in Rome, Handel wrote 2 such oratorios in Italian. The first performance of the first one, La Resurrezione, the Resurrection, was a huge, impressive event. The great composer Arcangelo Corelli, we hear a concerto grosso written by him tomorrow night in our concert. He was the concertmaster of this performance, and Handel wrote great violin solos for him. He was an enormous success, and this idea of the oratorio as an alternative to opera is something he never forgot, and something, as you will see, that became very important to him a little bit later. Now, here's another example of Handel managing his career. He's in sunny Italy. He's having the time of his life. And on a trip to Venice, he makes the acquaintance of the brother of the Elector of Hanover. Hanover is a city in northern Germany. And in 1710, he wrangles an appointment as Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover. Now let's think about this for a minute. It must be a really good job if he's going to leave sunny Italy and go back to gray, cold northern Germany. I've been there, and I'd rather be in Italy. So why on earth leave sunny Italy for cold and gray northern Germany? His choice of employment at Hanover may seem bizarre on the face of it. Since there was no opera at the court of Hanover, there was very little money for music, and there had never been a Kapellmeister before he got the appointment. And considering the fact that the first thing he did when he got to Hanover was negotiate a year's leave of absence with pay. He had a plan because he knew something very important. Shortly after he arrived in Hanover, as I say, he negotiated leave of absence and permission to travel to London. And basically, London was his home for the rest of his life. Why go to Hanover first, get a job for which there are no duties, and then leave? The answer lies in the complicated politics of Europe in the early 18th century. Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, born in 1660, died in 1727, was also the great-grandson of James I of England. Queen Anne was ill and had not much longer to live on the British throne. She died in 1714, just 2.5 years after Handel got to London. And that was the end of the Stuart line. Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, native German speaker, stood next in line to ascend the throne of England. And he became King George I. Queen Anne had been careful to keep Georg Ludwig out of English politics. She would not even let him into the country to serve in his legitimate role as a member of the House of Lords. Handel was, in effect, an advance man. He was in the employ of Georg Ludwig before he became King George, and Handel's trip to London served both his own and his patrons' interests. Through his friendship with John Arbuthnot, who was an amateur composer and poet and also the personal physician to Queen Anne, Handel was able to send reports back to Georg Ludwig of Hanover about the state of the Queen's health. Upon Anne's death in 1714, Georg Ludwig of Hanover became King George I, King of England and Ireland. He is the father, of course, of King George II and grandfather of King George III. Handel eventually became a naturalized English citizen. He signed his name many ways during this period, but perhaps inspired by his patron, the former Elector of Hanover, who became King George, Handel settled on the spelling of George. And so Georg Friedrich Handel became George Friedrich Handel. He spent more than 50 years as a resident of London, and the Groves Dictionary of Music, the premier musical reference, describes Handel as an English composer of German birth, just as it describes Igor Stravinsky as an American composer born in Russia. Where do we draw the line as to what nationality is? Is Henry Kissinger an American? Handel spent more than half his life in England and more than half his life as a naturalized English citizen. London in the early 1700s had developed an insatiable taste for Italian opera and Italian superstar singers. And Handel immediately threw himself into the operatic scene in London. His first London opera was written soon after he got there. In 1711, it was produced at the Queen's Theatre in the Haymarket. It was called Rinaldo, and it was an immense success, and it is still frequently performed today. He continued to write for that opera company, but it was poorly managed, and it failed after a few years. And so in 1720, King George I chartered a new opera company, the Royal Academy. And Handel became the music director, conductor, composer, and impresario. It was supported by subscriptions from the nobility, but its financial base depended upon the assumption that there would be full house for every performance and that ticket sales would cover expenses. So Handel became not only a composer, he became a showman. He had to keep the opera company afloat. Through the 1720s and the 1730s, he traveled to Italy at least once a year to scout and recruit the greatest Italian singers in Europe at the time. He paid them lavishly and produced an immense number of operatic performances in London. From 1720 to 1730, he wrote more than 2 operas a year. The Academy, again, was a huge artistic success, but a financial disaster, and eventually dissolved amid all kinds of internal dissension. It was one of the many times that Handel in his life went bankrupt and had to recover from financial catastrophe. Handel promptly founded another opera company in 1729. It ultimately suffered the same fate in 1733. Now he's 48 years old. He's at the peak of his powers. He is undaunted, and he presses on with his operatic compositions. This is the same year that Bach wrote that famous letter to the Elector of Saxony, sending the first 2 parts of the B minor Mass. They're both trying to advance their careers in the most different possible ways. Handel had composed an English oratorio in 1718 to honor the Duke of Chandos. It was called Esther. And it had much in common with the Italian oratorios. It had a linear plot. It was based on a biblical tune or biblical story. And he composed no further oratorios at all during his intense output of Italian operas. And then a friend and supporter saw an economic opening to revive the production of Esther. And so a chorus from the chapel choir sang, and the production was definitely staged with costumes. The revival was a great success. And Handel decided to produce the oratorio himself the following year at his newest project, which was as general manager of the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden. The Bishop of London, who had oversight over the chapel choir, put his foot down and forbade the use of the choir in a staged commercial production. There was still something a little unsavory about the theater world. And so the oratorio Esther was presented in concert format with no staging, no costumes. And that has become the standard for oratorio production ever since. The success of Esther established English oratorio as a new musical form, and the public in England began to recognize this. And although Handel continued to cling to the outmoded Italian model, Italian opera, long after its popularity had declined, he was also pragmatic enough to see the potential of oratorio and began to feature it in his opera seasons. He began to shift over because he saw the audience dwindling for opera, the audience growing for oratorio. There was also a new competitor to Italian opera. The Italians were becoming the Londoners were becoming a little tired of these operas about gods and goddesses and mythic figures in a language that none of them could understand. And so English taste for Italian opera was waning, and there was a growing interest in new English language operas like the big success of 1728, John Gay's Beggar's Opera. This is an opera, this is a musical piece that sort of turned London upside down and once and for all popped the bubble of the Italian opera fad. In the mid-1930s, a few years after John Gay's work had appeared, Handel made one last attempt at an opera company. As I said, it was Covent Garden. It too lasted only a few years. And in the midst of it all, he suffered a stroke at the age of 52 in 1737, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to conduct. Miraculously, he seems to have recovered, but he had already begun to turn toward oratorio to supplant opera. And from 1741 onward until his death in 1759, he devoted himself exclusively to this new English art form, oratorio. The poet laureate John Dryden, born in 1631, died in 1700, wrote two poems or odes in honor of Saint Cecilia, and both were set to music by Handel. The first one was called From Heavenly Harmony. We call it the Ode to Saint Cecilia, and it was heard last year in our mission concert. That work is not to be confused with this one, which is the other Saint Cecilia-related poem. Dryden called this one the Ode to Saint Cecilia's Day, but we perform it under its published title, Alexander's Feast, or The Power of Music. It was written with typical Handelian speed in only 5 weeks, and it was premiered within a month of its completion at Covent Garden on February 19th, 1736. The libretto was assembled from Dryden's poem by one Newburgh Hamilton, who was a musician and tutor and friend of Handel's. And Hamilton made a few minor additions, but basically the text that is being sung today is the text from the great English poet John Dryden. And Hamilton kept fairly close to the original Dryden text. I've created super titles. Normally we project English translations of the foreign language works. But Paul Goodwin and I felt that this poetry is so precious and so archaic. There are spellings, different spellings. There are apostrophes where you don't expect to see an apostrophe. The language is a little florid. It's the language of the 17th century. And so we are projecting the complete text of John Dryden above the performers as it's being sung. And I hope that this will enhance your understanding of what they're singing about. As I say, the language is a little old-fashioned, but it's very charming. When they talk about a blaze of light, rouse him with a peal of thunder, it's spelled R-O-U-Z-E. They're just charming bits of language. Also, in Handel's time, Handel was very savvy about the English language. And, for example, in the opening recitative of Handel's Messiah, which I've sung a million times, that her iniquity is pardoned. And Handel sets pardoned with 2 notes, pardoned. But in Handel's time, they would have said pardoned, pardoned. And so he writes pardoned, P-A-R-D-O-N apostrophe D. That's the information he gives to the singer. You are not to sing pardoned, you are to sing pardoned, which was a more avant-garde way of pronouncing the language at the time. That's why I say you'll see a lot of apostrophes used in the language of this afternoon's poetry. Sighed, she sighed, he sighed, S-I-G-H-E-D. Handel spells it S-I-G-H apostrophe D to be very sure that his soloist is not going to say sighed. It's a different linguistic approach to the London English of the 1700s. A dear friend of mine who's now retired from Indiana University wrote an enormous thesis on the pronunciation of Handel's language, of Handel's English, and it is from that that I overcame the prejudice that I was taught when I was going to school, which was that Handel was a foreigner and didn't know how to set English. Oh no, he was very good at setting English. He might have spoken it with an accent, but his use of the English language was just as brilliant as his use of any other languages in the music that he wrote. The poem that we're hearing today is based on an historically unreliable anecdote about Alexander the Great. It's part of the mythology about Alexander the Great, who, after he defeated King Darius, or Darius, as it was said in the 18th century in London, King Darius of Persia, was induced by the Greek courtesan Thais, or Thais, or Thais, depending on where you were born, the Greek courtesan Thais, to burn Darius's palace, actually the palace of Xerxes. It's very complicated, but it serves as a pretense for staging the scene of this banquet. Alexander is shown being entertained by his troubadour, his bard, whose name was Timotheus, or Timotheus, depending upon where you were born, who played the lyre, the harp, and the flute. And Timotheus is depicted as arousing various different kinds of emotions in his listeners by the power of his music, and then finally giving way to the superior power of Saint Cecilia. The historically real Greek poet and musician Timotheus was famous for his ability to represent in music the phenomena of nature. He belonged to a much earlier generation, but he's depicted as being at this banquet with Alexander. One of the things to watch for is Handel showing off in this piece. He's absolutely boasting to us all in this piece about the virtuosity of his writing for orchestra and voices. Because Timotheus and the other soloists who are depicting the emotions here bring about anger, sadness, happiness, joy, grief, horror, terror, fear. All these different emotions are called up, and Handel is showing us the power of music, which is the subtitle of this oratorio. I think this is one of the most fascinating bits of this oratorio, is that unlike Messiah, Handel here is showing off in Alexander's Feast. This was second only to Messiah in popularity during Handel's lifetime. It was performed many, many times when he was alive, and it was, as I say, second only to Messiah. This was the most popular piece. And I've sung it many times as tenor soloist, and I don't understand actually why the piece is not more popular than it is. I'll explain one possible reason in just a moment. It's also one of the only two oratorios published during his lifetime, along with Messiah. Mozart and Baron Gottfried von Swieten, his patron in Vienna 30 or 40 years later, thought highly enough of Alexander's Feast that Mozart reorchestrated the work to present it to the public in Vienna in a more updated and modern style. And Goethe was another great poet and musician who expressed a great admiration for this work. Tonight, or this afternoon I should say, we're reconstructing the circumstances of the premiere of this work in 1736. When I said to you a moment ago that it was not as popular as some of the others and I couldn't figure out why, one of the reasons could be that it's a tiny bit on the short side. It's just not quite long enough for a full evening's performance. And so, at the original premiere in 1736, Handel, in the midst of this oratorio, performed 3 different instrumental concertos. Soon after the piece begins, when the recitative says, Timotheus raised his lute and strummed the strings, and the sound ascended to the heavens, the action of the oratorio stops, and you will hear a concerto in B flat in 3 movements for harp, organ, and instruments. This is the very piece that was played at that very spot in this very oratorio in its premiere in 1736. So this is a kind of reenactment. It's also a premiere, a world premiere, and we're having fun with this as well today in another way that I'll be able to tell you about in just a moment. Then the second concerto came at the end of the intermission, and the third concerto came at the very end of the piece before the final chorus. We're omitting that third concerto, but we are doing a work at the end of the intermission before the final, before the second half of the concert. This work was revised in 1737, 1739. It was performed in Dublin in 1742. It had numerous performances in London and elsewhere throughout his lifetime, and he changed it a little bit from performance to performance. So the version we're hearing today includes an alto soloist, which in the version I have performed in my singing career did not occur. Most of us are familiar with the version for soprano, tenor, and baritone. This is a different one, and some of the solo material has been reassigned, and there's an additional duet that doesn't appear in the original version. Handel was a showman. He was very good at tailoring his music for the people who were going to sing it. The concerto is written for a harp, and our harpist today is Cheryl Ann Fulton. She is probably America's leading historical harpist. She plays on the medieval harp, the modern Lyon and Healy pedal harp, and the instrument today is known as a triple harp. It's known as a Welsh triple harp. It's known as a triple harp because it has 3 rows of strings. It has 1 row down the middle, 1 row here, and 1 row here. Your hands play the outer rows of strings and sometimes reach inside and pluck one of the notes inside. The harp that most people are familiar with is the great, huge, ornate harp, most notably made by the Lyon and Healy Company in Chicago. This has pedals all around the bottom, and the harpist can press those pedals, which cause little levers to turn up here, which retune the strings. You can retune the strings in the middle of a movement. You can change all the Fs to F sharp. You can change all the Bs to B flat, etc., etc. You can play in any key. The triple harp, with its 3 rows of strings, has no pedals. And so it's designed to play in C major. If you want to play in the key of F, you have to retune all the B naturals down to B flat. If you want to play in the key of G, you have to tune all the Fs up to F sharp. So you can't move very fast with this. If you want to play in a different key, it takes you a while to get ready to do so. To play in the key of B flat, all the B naturals would be tuned down to B flat, and all the E's would be tuned down to E flat. That gives you a harp that is going to play in B flat. The bass notes are played with the right hand, the melody notes played with the left hand, and as I say sometimes for passing tones, you reach through between the strings and play the center row of strings. There are, I think, 37 strings on the right hand. The middle row is 34 strings, and the treble side, which is over here on the left hand, is 27 strings. It's a very beautiful instrument. And it is very much the type of instrument that Handel's audience would have known and would have heard. Now, the one other interesting and I think thrilling aspect of this performance is that in 1736 it was a world premiere. And in 1736 there was a world premiere of his harp concerto. And so, I said to you that we're putting a piece of music, an instrumental music, at the end of the intermission. That would have been, in Handel's day, in 1736, it would have been a concerto grosso by George Friedrich Handel, but we are replacing it with an orchestral suite by Johann Sebastian Bach, the most beloved of his 4 orchestral suites, with the beloved air in G. And we are respectfully removing that air in G, and if you applaud loudly enough, we'll play it as an encore. And in place of the air in G is our 2nd annual Carmel commission. We have commissioned a wonderful American composer to write a new air for us that will be performed at that moment. Last week was the world premiere, and this is the 2nd world premiere. And I'm happy today to be able to introduce to you the man who wrote the music. He was born in 1951 in Ravenna, Ohio. He began piano studies at the age of 9. He went to Kent State University there, received a piano degree. He earned his Master of Arts in Musicology from New York University, another Master of Arts and PhD from Harvard. He was on the Harvard faculty for a while, and is now Professor of Music at Haverford College, where he's been since 1983. In 1987, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an honor that has been conferred upon people like Leonard Bernstein and Giancarlo Menotti. His catalog of 115 compositions includes commissions by the Emerson Quartet, the American Quartet, the Moscow Quartet, the Chicago Symphony, Milwaukee Symphony, and on and on and on. He has been a resident artist at more than 40 American colleges and universities, and with symphonies and festivals and universities all over the world. He's also a pianist with an international career. He champions the works of his fellow composers and has had more than a dozen pieces written for or dedicated to him by other composers. And what these statistics don't tell you is that Kurt Cacioppo is a composer of really great expressive power and wit and emotional appeal. He will be presenting his own lecture here tomorrow at 4 p.m., and I promise you I will be here to introduce you. And I thought it would be great to invite him to the podium today for the remaining 20 minutes or so to give you a chance to meet the man who wrote the music, whose new work we are unveiling at the Bach Festival this summer. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Kurt Cacioppo. I'll shake your hand and hand you a microphone. It's good to see you, Kurt.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say how thrilled we are to have you here with us. How thrilled we are. I've been with a lot of organizations that have commissioned new works. I've had works written for me. And you hope and pray that when the music arrives, it's something you're going to actually want to perform, you know? And we're thrilled with your music. The players love it. We had a great reaction to it last week from the audience. Tell us a little bit about the experience of writing a commission for such a specific situation as this.
Right. Well, first let me say it's a real honor to be here. I've heard about the Carmel Bach Festival for years, and to finally become a participant and be a resident composer for a little while and hang out with you. You know, I felt when I got here that I would blend right in because you were the first person I met, then Aaron, one of the sound engineers, and you know, we all have this. And I just thought, yo, where have I been all this time? This is where I belong. And I guess in the same way, I slid into this assignment of supplying a new movement in the Bach Orchestral Suite No. 3, where this famous air on the G string is usually played. That was a little bit daunting, actually, because I grew up on that suite, and you know, I think I accompanied my sisters on that suite. My one sister played the oboe. There's an arrangement for oboe. Then my other sister played the violin. You know, so this is one of the monuments of music. Now I'm supposed to fill that slot, but I got over that, and I was really touched that Paul tracked me down. Paul Goodwin, this great conductor that you have here now. I was in Italy. I go to Italy quite often, and I was there back in November to do a series of concerts. And I came back and I found an email from Paul Goodwin, whose name I had heard, but I wasn't really familiar with his work just yet. And he had tracked me down because he had heard an oboe concerto. He, of course, is an oboist. Had heard an oboe concerto that I had written under somewhat the same circumstances as this. It wasn't for a Bach festival. It was rather for a Vivaldi festival in Venice. Actually, was taking place at the church where Vivaldi worked for almost 40 years of his career. And so Paul heard this concerto, and he particularly liked the second movement, of it, the slow movement, which was actually based on the Gloria, the famous choral work, the Gloria of Vivaldi. And I think that maybe got his brain percolating, and he decided, well, maybe this guy could fill this slot in the Bach, which is filling the bigger slot in the Handel, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I was really up for that because I've done this kind of thing before, Vivaldi and so on. And so it was a very happy message to receive on my email, and I said right away, I'll try and do that. The only thing is, I thought it was for next year. And then Elizabeth sent me the contract, and it said, deadline May 15th. So I had to get inspired real fast.
That I didn't know before. And how did you get inspired?
How did I get inspired? Well, last week was a lot of fun, and many people came up to me afterwards, and most of them, the most common reaction was to say, so you're a jazz composer, right? You're a jazz guy. You have a jazz background. I'm not kidding. And even in the news, there was a newspaper mention after the concert last week, and it said very nice things. But the piece was very jazz infused.
Wow.
Very jazz infused. Not just jazz infused, but very jazz infused.
Wow.
Yeah. So, well, jazz is a source of inspiration for me. I wouldn't say at all. I don't pretend to be a professional level jazzer or anything. Our sons are, but it is in my background, and it is going through me. And anyway, all these comments kind of made me think that one of my heroes made me think of this comment by one of my heroes, who was Bill Evans, a great jazz pianist. His music got me through high school, actually. Without him, I don't know what would have happened. Well, he was classically trained, and he does fantastic harmony. He does fantastic things with harmony and layering. He actually had an album called Conversations with Myself. So it's just him, and he laid down one track, and then they played it back, and he improvised over that. And then they played both of those back, and he laid on a third track. And so Conversations with Myself. This is counterpoint, this is like Bach. And what Bill would say is that if Bach were alive in our contemporary times, he would be a jazz musician. So there you have it. I guess jazz was kind of going through me at the time, and although I did play very much off of the original. I wanted to use the original at least as a point of departure and a point of reference.
Well, that's what I get when I don't want to give spoilers here, but when I hear you starting from a place that's near Bach, I can hear the shape of some of the musical elements from the air in G coming out, and then you take that and then you go somewhere very original with it. And I think what interests me, what I like about your music, is that it appeals to my heart as well as to my head, that I have an emotional reaction to your music, which in this case is a positive one, and that it isn't just clever. It isn't just appealing to my intellectual curiosity about what you're going to do in this place in the middle of Bach, but the piece has an emotional engagement that got to me from the first hearing. I had heard it 4 or 5 times in rehearsal before the performance. And that, I think, is a very attractive attribute of your music, and I've heard some of your other pieces, that you appeal to us on different levels. And that seems to be where you are as a musician as well. I mean, I would love to hear you. I would love to hear you in a concert where you were actually performing as a pianist, because I think that your music gets to us in so many different ways.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I will play. I'll do a little playing tomorrow, actually. Yeah. But I did very, very satisfying, gratifying to hear you say these things. Yeah. When I was in school, when I was starting college, I entered as a double major in piano and composition. And this was in 1969.
This was at Kent State?
This was at Kent. And, there were basically two things you could do as a composer. The environment was quite restrictive. You could write hardcore serial music based on the methods of Arnold Schoenberg, who actually I admire very much. Or you could go the aleatoric route. You could write kind of random chance music, noise music, and so on. These things were kind of the valid forms of expression available to a composer at that time. And, John Adams, you all know John Adams, right? John Adams spent a lot of time in minimalism, but I think in his autobiography he says it's kind of worn out now, and we got to get away from this minimalism thing. We got to get back to the harmony of Schumann and Wagner.
Yeah.
Well, I was already with the harmony of Schumann and Wagner in 1969, and it's been continuous, from that point. So I didn't do very well as a composition major. I was deemed a writer of museum music. I like museums. I don't know what the problem would be with that, but I went to the Steinbeck Museum and the De Young Museum and all this. Well, so I dropped the composition major. Museum music, or I was deemed irrelevant, not relating to, my fellow man. Well, so however many years later, here we are.
Yeah. There are many, I was about 4 years ahead of you in college, and I remember those days in the 60s, the aleatoric music, the serialism, atonal music that was done by basically throwing pieces of paper in the air and seeing what order they came down on the floor. And I hope that music has outlived its uselessness. Because it doesn't get into the heart. And maybe I'm prejudiced as a singer who spent a lot of time singing the music of Puccini and Wagner and Verdi. Maybe I am spoiled in having my heart tickled by music. But I want the music to somehow express something to me that has a fullness of humanity in it, and not simply, as was the case back then, I think, one composer with an academic appointment writing for all his buddies with academic appointments to congratulate themselves on how clever the music was. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but the caricature is not unfair, I think.
Right. And who didn't listen to each other's music.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of an ivory tower period. Now, you'll still find pockets of the avant-garde, especially throughout Europe. This is interesting. I went to, where was it? Trieste. I did a concert of music of mine and music of fellow composers from Italy and America. And we were invited to Trieste, and we were hosted by a really great guy, Gianpaolo Corral, very prolific composer. And afterwards, he talked to me, and he admired. He was saying very complimentary things about the eclecticism, I guess you could say, of my writing, because I mean, there's some jazz in it. There's all kinds. I like all kinds of music. I mean, I heard Alan Jackson last night after the rodeo. But and he said, it's really great because that's true freedom.
Yeah.
And he said, it's so refreshing in this European environment where people can't do anything unless they bow down and recite the phrase Darmstadt docet. Because Darmstadt and Cologne, that was the seat of the really hardcore avant-garde back in the late 50s and early 60s, and that it still has a strong grip on a certain constituency. But I found audiences, despite that, in Europe and elsewhere, to be very receptive to this kind of more eclectic writing, because it I think speaks to the listener on a kind of fundamental, universal level. Exactly. I was accused also, and I remember this. The dean said to me, the dean of the School of Music said to me at that time when I was just starting out, "You have too much of the listener in you." So,
what did he mean by that?
Well, I wrote things that were fun to listen to, I think. I mean, they didn't send you out of the room,
Yeah, and see, this is what puzzles me about that era, is who wouldn't think about that? Did Mozart not think about that? Did Bach not think about it? Handel certainly did. Who doesn't think? I'm not talking about just entertainment. Entertainment is one aspect of it, but that the music, to me, the Baroque masters teach us that they must entertain us and they must also move our hearts at the same time. And to me, that's great music. Mm. It's not enough to just be entertained. It's not enough to just write something that's interesting. It has to get to me. It has to engage me. Mm-hmm. And if you're not interested in engaging the audience, then what you're doing is an abstract experiment that has no place in the continuum of humanity. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you? I mean, is that too strong a statement?
Well, no, I basically agree with that. So I confessed and pled guilty and dropped the composition major. Yeah. I just graduated as a piano major.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I had some other interests along, on the side too. But people ask, do you worry about accessibility? And actually, I don't. And the way I explain it now is that on the Earth today there are 7 billion people. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't be that different than 1 billion of them anyway,
Yeah.
And, there's some subset of that 1 billion that probably will like my stuff, so I don't worry about it.
Well, we're among that subset. That 1 billion will start right here.
That's why I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here.
Yeah.
Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, we're going to let Kurt loose right here for an hour, and the topic is channeling tradition for the new millennium. Is that the right title, more or less?
I guess that's what I said.
Yeah, I'm sure that you and I have the same skill, which is somebody says in October, I need a title for the lecture you're going to give next July. And so you pick a title that sounds really cool, really engaging, and gives you a huge amount of freedom to create any kind of content you want when you finally get there. Uh-huh. But this is one amazing guy, and he is both personally and professionally really accessible, and I'm so glad you're here. And I commend to you the the place where the air in G would have been today is going to be this man's music, and it deserves to be there. It's a real treat. It's a real treat. Until tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Kurt, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. So much fun. Thank you so much. It's time for us all to make our way up there. The Tower Brass will be beginning in a few minutes. Visit our festival boutique. And right next to the festival boutique is the Art of Music art raffle. Enjoy the afternoon, and I'll see you here tomorrow night before tomorrow night's concert. Thank you so much.